Dr. Irving J. Lee, professor of speech at Northwestern University, is professionally concerned with that problem as he teaches his courses in general semantics. He is bringing to these programs a discussion of the matter of communications and understanding as he takes up the problem of talking sense. Today he asks this question: what is a good observer? Dr. Lee.
The problem of the good observer, as distinguished from the poor observer, is a very old one, and I'm not entirely sure that I can say too many new things about it. Think very roughly and very generally with me for a moment, would you? A good observer, how do you distinguish him from a poor one? It would have been interesting, perhaps, in this session, if I could have brought some dialogue between Dr. Watson and Sherlock Holmes. You recall the many occasions when Dr. Watson will look and not see very much, and then Mr. Holmes will proceed to look and uncover a great number of details about the thing or the person they were looking at. Now, in an attempt to describe the difference between a good observer, is he one who merely sees more details? Does he remember things he saw? Does he see nuances, tiny subtleties? What's the difference between a good and a poor observer, and what has that to do with the business of talking sense? I'd like to approach this question through a kind of round-the-barn approach so that I might come in by the back door. Would you, as a way then of approaching this through the back door, think of a very small demonstration or game with me? Suppose I ask you to look at this, please, and then, if you can do this mentally or out loud or silently, it doesn't make any difference, answer this question, please. The question is, what do you call what you see? What do you call what you see on this chart? And it would be fun and a great deal of interest if I could find out some of the things that you all are saying to yourselves. What might some of the things be? Let me describe what many, many hundreds of people have said when we give stimuli, something like this. They will say geometric design, drawing, figures, shapes, geometrical design, black marks on a white background, figures, drawing, doodling, modern art. All of these words I perhaps would put in group one. And let me just write as a summary of these just the word designs, designs or figures. Then we find that a lot of people will say something like this. They will say, I see a variety of shapes. And I would put that in category 2, just as a way of making a simple distinction. A variety of shapes. Or they will say, I see some different figures up here. Or they say, I see a number of quite different things, where the idea of some variety or some difference comes in. The word various may sometimes be used. Then in category 3, sometimes people will say things like, I see straight and curved lines. Or I see straight and curved lines. I see open and closed figures. I see regular and irregular figures. In other words, that's a category. And then we sometimes run onto people who will indicate these individually. They will write or think or say to themselves, circle, triangle, square, whorl, rectangle, and so on. They will name them individually. And they will say, I see 10 figures, including a circle, a triangle, a square, a right angle triangle, and so on. In other words, they notice the respect in which each of these is an individual item. In other words, may I very quickly indicate that the answers we get to this kind of a little game indicate that some people will emphasize the respect in which these are similar. They note the similarities, their design. And as we go from 1 to 4, some people note the differences. That is, they note that there are peculiar, differentiating things up here, and they notice the differences between them. When we do this with several thousand people, the great percentage of them are in one or two. See, very, very often, about 80% of any group will be here, and only about 5% will be in category 4. So what do these bits of data mean? And there are many illustrations that I could give you which indicate that the tendency when one gives people a number of things like this is to use the word figures, shapes, a word which emphasizes the respects in which they're all similar. Now that's very curious from one point of view, because one of the things that it is very easy to demonstrate is that in the world in which you and I live, no two things, no two happenings, no two circumstances, no two situations, as one of my students said, no two nothing are exactly alike in all respects. No two cigarettes that you take from a package of cigarettes, no two nails, no two dimes hammered out at the mint have ever been exactly alike in all respects. Each one of them was different from each other in some way, in some small item or in some detail or some aspect. To say it another way, I can't write my name twice exactly the same way, and I venture to assume that you can't either. So far as I know, nobody has. I can't walk 2 steps exactly the same way. I can't say the same word the same way twice and make the same electrical impression on a gadget. I can't strike middle C on the piano twice and produce the same number of vibrations and the same effect on a measuring machine. No 2 inches of wool on a strand that came out of the same dyeing vat will have exactly the same color. No 2 hairs on my head, no 2 centimeters of any one strand of hair exactly alike. If one takes a pistol and fills it with cartridges, with shells, proceeds to shoot them all, then analyzes the cartridges, no 2 of the bullets will have exactly the same markings. In other words, one of the things that is very easy to demonstrate is that in the world in which we live, things are never exactly alike. I better say, we have so far not found any 2 of anything exactly alike. No 2 photographs taken of exactly the same situation will be exactly alike. No 2 drawings, no 2 pressings of records from the same master copy will be exactly alike. No 2, in short, if I may repeat myself, no 2 of nothing have ever been found to be exactly alike in every conceivable respect. In short, we're led to an interesting conclusion that nature never quite repeats herself. Well, what difference does that make? So what, I suppose, is the obvious question. There are differences in the world, but of course we can see similarities. Please observe that every one of the items on my original chart, each one of these was different from the other in some respect. There was a difference, and what we tend to do is to submerge the differences the moment one starts to talk. Now I must ask the question, of what value is it that we see similarities? Well, it's rather easy to describe those. If we couldn't see the similarities, we would never learn anything. The teacher teaches how to do an arithmetic problem. The teacher then gives the class an arithmetic assignment. If the youngsters couldn't learn to see the similarities, they wouldn't learn anything. Furthermore, think how expedient and convenient and easy it is. Very quickly we say, these are figures. These are designs. That is, we wrap them all together. It's very, very easy. And then in the third place, it is the seeing of similarities between things that superficially look different that is the essence of wisdom and the mark of insight. So we couldn't get along unless we talked in the patterns of 1 and 2 and 3. But now, of what value would it be if we saw differences in the world? Well, I should like to say that it is the mark of sophistication to be able to see differences. I remember being in the garden of a friend of mine who had many, many, many dahlias. And he had 3 rows of white dahlias, and I asked very stupidly, what's the reason for all of these dahlias which are exactly alike? I shan't repeat his sarcastic comment, but it was to the effect that I simply was too unsophisticated to see the differences. That is, I was the amateur, the tyro, and they all looked alike to me. And it is the inability to see the differences that is the mark of the uneducated, the unsophisticated person. The trained person, the person who sees the differences, he knows whether it is one great pianist playing the piece or another great pianist. One knows whether the writing was done by a 19th century person or a 16th century person. The seeing of the difference is the mark of sophistication. And from one point of view, I should also likely to argue that it is also the ultimate earmark of what we mean by training. What we mean by training is the man who ultimately can tell the difference. The woodsman is trained to see all of the variations. The track coach is trained to see that a boy who does it this way won't succeed and a boy who does it that way will. It is because he sees the difference that you go to the golf pro or to any teacher. Indeed, it is the ability to pick out differences that is what you mean by the man who makes the test. I once sat in on it with a group of people testing coffee, and there were 20 or 30 small cups with very small amounts. I could only distinguish 4 or 5 varieties. My distinguished friends were able to make many, many distinctions, and it was a mark of their distinction that they could make the distinctions which the unsophisticated person didn't. Now then, my point, I suppose, can be summarized in a nutshell. I want to suggest that when people tend to see similarities only or exclusively, then we get into trouble. And that it is the mark of the mature man who sees differences and similarities, who sees similarities among things that are different, and who sees differences when the unsophisticated see similarities. Now, if I may, I would like to put this in somewhat more generalized terms. May I define a good observer? And let me please try to explain this diagram. Note some very simple angles. And here is an angle with a curve underneath. Now suppose I were to make a statement about each item. I would say, I would talk about that, and I would talk about this one, and about this one. I would talk about each one. And if I wanted to, I might make a conclusion statement in which I took every item into account. I would talk about, in other words, let's say I was talking about those dahlias. I looked at this one, and that one, and that one, so that my statement took all of them into account. And then if I wanted to take some action, I would take some action on the strength of that conclusion. Now, may I compare that good observer with a poor observer? What's he like? Well, he has the same stimuli, and he makes item statements about some of the entities, and then he draws a conclusion on some, and let's call that a limited conclusion. Let's say I, for example, ate a certain kind of fish, and I ate one kind of fish and ate another, ate another, ate another, and then suppose my conclusion happened to be those fish are not tasty. Then suppose you presented me, or I came upon, this additional item with the circle. Suppose now I went to sit down in front of it with my conclusion, these fish are unpleasant. Then my reaction to this one would tend not to be in terms of its uniqueness. My reaction would tend to be to it in terms of my previous judgment. And thus I would have not a conclusion based on all of the details, but a conclusion based on some of them. And thus my behavior might be quite different. Now may I take this out of the realm of the generality and see if I can get slightly more specific. But just as a way of indicating that it is extremely easy and widespread for us to lump all things together and to think in terms of similarities. I'm reminded of a story that Lord Halifax once told while amusing a banquet audience in Washington during the war. It's a story of a tramp ship with a heterogeneous passenger list stranded on an idyllic Polynesian islet. And as he tells the story, soon the little spot was a beehive of activity. The Germans were drilling the natives into an army. The Americans opened a general store and an auto agency. The Australians started a racetrack. The French a restaurant. 2 Scots were financing the whole show, and a couple of Englishmen were still standing around waiting to be introduced. That is, it is easy to talk about Scotsmen and Americans and Englishmen, and it's easy to lump them all together, and it is exceedingly easy not to notice the differences, the peculiarities, the individuality, the uniqueness of each of the members of this great group. Now may I come back to my distinction between the poor observer and the good observer to see if I can point out that our habits of talking in a way reflect the way we observe. And if we could change our observing, we might change our patterns of talking and vice versa. But now let's come on back to the poor observer. He's a man who has a few experiences. He comes to a conclusion. He then brings his conclusion to bear on the new one so that he hardly sees the new characteristic. A simple example. This is from a novel by Willard Motley entitled Knock on Any Door. And in the example, Nick Romano, the young boy who appears, throughout the story, we meet him after he has had some trouble with the police. And he had trouble with cops, if you forgive that indignity. And he had met one or two or three or four of them, and they had treated him fairly severely, so that as a result of that, he said, this cop didn't treat me so good, this one, and he draws a conclusion, cops are no good. And then comes the story. At the corner of 12th Street stood the old policeman. He was always there during school hours to help the youngsters across the wide thoroughfare. He'd stop traffic with an upstretched hand when there were a bunch of kids waiting on the curb to see that they got across safely. And sometimes he had candy stuffed down in his pockets to give them, or pennies. He was a big man with a round middle under his large blue coat. Now, up in front of Nick, the kids were running to meet the policeman. Hello, Mr. O'Callahan. Hello, Mr. O'Callahan, they all shouted at once, half singing the words. Nick came to the curb and stepped down. Will you wait a minute, lad, O'Callahan called. What? Nick answered with hostility. Old O'Callahan stood with one foot on the curb. He hoisted himself up on the sidewalk. Phew, he said, blowing air. Sure, and the devil is in me feet. Nick's eyes lowered sullenly. Cops ain't no good. You're a new lad, ain't you? None of them. Yes. Old O'Callahan put his hand in his pocket, saying, "'Tis the new lads you're in the neighborhood," and pulled out a baseball. Would you be interested in a baseball, lad? Sure, and I got it at Wrigley Field. I caught it myself. Now, what would I be doing with a baseball? There's a little fat around the middle that I'm getting. He patted his belly. 'Twas a good catch for a man me size. He chuckled good-naturedly, went on. 'Twas hit by Gabby Hartnett, another good Irishman. Nick didn't take the outstretched ball. Old O'Callahan looked surprised. Now, what's the matter with you? Take it. You play the game, don't you? No, Nick said. Nick started across the street. Here, take it anyway, O'Callahan called, making a motion as if to toss it underhand to him. Your friends can use it. Keep it, cop, Nick said over his shoulder as he went on. Now, from my point of view, how is one to understand Nick? Nick, from my point of view, is an exceedingly poor observer. He meets cop 1, cop 2, cop 3, a number of them. He comes to a conclusion, cops ain't no good. And then suddenly, he comes on O'Callahan. Now, in the story, O'Callahan is friendly, wants to give him a baseball, wants to talk with him, in a mood utterly different from the policeman. But Nick doesn't see him. Nick doesn't see him at all. Nick is thinking in terms of similarities. Cops are all alike. Nick is, in a sense, far too imprisoned by his assumption that policemen are all alike, so that Nick never really faces this man. And we've learned in training people, because in English we have so many words that emphasize similarities. We learn words like cops and cars and houses and teachers and Americans and so on. And we've learned the habit of putting a little index, a little number, so that we talk about cop 1 and cop 2 and cop 3 and so on. In other words, for Nick, cops were all alike. There were no differences. Think, if you will, of the dozens and dozens of daily situations that it would be possible to talk about. That is, little Johnny is in an arithmetic class, and the teacher is, let's say, not entirely sympathetic or not entirely friendly. Johnny comes home. What does he say? Does he say, the teacher in this arithmetic class was unpleasant and unfriendly? If you listen closely, you may hear Johnny saying, teachers are unfriendly. I can't do arithmetic. Arithmetic classes are no fun. That is, Johnny immediately neglects the individual. Johnny immediately moves to limited conclusions, so that when Johnny gets into an arithmetic class in another year, he may, unless he's grown wiser and sophisticated, so he sees differences, he may tend to look upon the new arithmetic teacher in terms of the devastating experience of the old. Or, what we find even more often, Johnny won't even go into the arithmetic class if he can help it. Now, in school, we have control over him. But think of the larger human relations, how we tend not to observe, how we tend not to be willing to observe the peculiarities of what's involved. I've run onto many situations in minority relations among human beings. A man will have an experience with a member of a minority group. It makes no difference who the minority group is. He will have an experience with one man, with another, with a third, and then listen to him talk. Does he say, that particular member of a minority group pushed me in the subway or the streetcar or on the street? Does he say that? Or does he say, those fellas? The tendency is to lose sight of the individual. The tendency is to neglect the differences. And from my point of view, one, I suppose, of the deepest steps that one can take in the development of human sensitivity is to discover the differences between things. There is a slogan that may somehow be relevant. It is, we tend to discriminate against people to the degree that we fail to distinguish between them. And the discovery of the difference becomes somehow liberating. Now, in English, it is very easy to speak in generic terms. By that I mean, it is very easy to emphasize the respect in which things are alike. For example, other peoples do not find it as easy to be as generic and emphasize similarities as much as we do. For example, in the American Indian language, the Mohican, there are, I'm told, different words for cutting various objects. There is a word to cut a tree, and there is another word to cut your finger, and there is another word to cut meat from the side of a steer. But there is no word in Mohican for cutting. In Mohican, there is a well-designed sense of the difference. There is no word for the similarity cutting. Among the Cherokee, for example, there are 13 quite different verbs to denote particular kinds of washing, but there is no verb in Cherokee to denote washing as such. It isn't possible, I imagine, I am told, for one Cherokee lady to meet another and, speaking Cherokee, to say, have you done your washing? As we can. If you mean clothes, you have to use a verb for clothes. If you mean have you done washing of the youngsters, you have to use a separate word. In English, the emphasis on similarities is so great, it is so devastating, that it is almost easier to talk in terms of similarities. No, let me say that differently. It is as easy to talk in similarities as the effort is required to bring out the differences. In other words, it is easy for me to go to downtown into a store and meet a salesgirl behind the counter. And if she says to me, if she's difficult and impertinent and impatient, it is far easier, and I am far more likely to go home and tell somebody, you know, those salesgirls downtown are exceedingly unpleasant. It takes an act of scrutiny, an act of insight, an act of discrimination for me to say, that particular girl behind the counter ill-treated me. Now, understand, I'm perfectly willing to recognize that there are some statements that can be made, and made with great acuity, about great masses of things. Yes. But the moment one talks about masses of things, there is a tendency to neglect the differences. There is a tendency to neglect the specifics, the variety, the nuances, the kind of richness that there is in the world. And finally, when one talks in terms of similarities, the tendency is to see a little bit less. We go into the forest and we see trees. The next time you do, would it be interesting to say, I saw tree 1 and tree 2 and tree 3 and tree 4? Instead of going to the museum and trying to see the pictures, wouldn't it be interesting if the next time one tried to see picture 1 and looked at it, and then saw picture 2 and all of the things that inhere in it? And it is this attempt to discover the differences that we find sometimes exerts a very protective effect on the varieties of stupidity that I frequently find. And of course, there is one other and sharper reason why we tend to see similarities quite apart from our training. And that is, our behavior tends to be so hasty. It is so easy and so relatively easy to talk about the similarities where it takes an active effort to notice the differences. There are many illustrations. May I just give you one final one? This is a story about a boy named White who went to work for the bee company. He was put in the shipping room packing unfinished castings into boxes. The castings had rough edges and had to be handled with leather gloves. Soon the raw edges would wear down through the gloves and onto knuckles, and since that was so, sticks were used to tamp down the straw that was placed around the castings. Now, the boy wore out a couple of tamping sticks a day and had to cut new ones out of scrap lumber. One afternoon, he was leaning against the shipping case, whittling a smooth handle on a new tamping stick. The new plant superintendent came in on his first visit to the shipping department. He was interested in efficiency. When he saw young White, he glared at the lad, nodded his head threateningly. The boy jumped to his feet to tell about the tamping stick, but the superintendent spoke first. So you think you can get by with loafing and whittling on the job, eh? Just because nobody ever comes to the shipping room, you're fired right now. Get out. It would be possible to think of the superintendent as a person who wasn't observing the particular, unique, peculiar characteristics of this situation. I assume that in other occasions when the superintendent saw boys whittling, he came to a conclusion: whittling a stick means he's wasting time. He's costing the company money. And with that conclusion, he proceeds to look at the boy White. Now, there is a very real sense in which I think it could be said that the superintendent never really looked at White at all. What he did was to see him in terms of the image of similarity which he had seen before. And if we go through life seeing the image of similarity in all things, we very rarely read anew. We very rarely see anew. We very rarely hear anew. And thus, if one would talk sense, there comes to be wisdom and insight in the attempt to achieve insight in the direction of differences. And thus, it might be a very interesting thing for you to try as you walk down the street today or tomorrow to see what differences you see.